It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning when I stepped onto my porch with my usual cup of coffee in hand. The air was crisp, the birds were chirping, and everything seemed perfect until I noticed it. Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. Please listen to the whole story and give me a comment about your feelings. Thanks everyone for watching. My prized tomato plants, the ones I'd nurtured for months, stood there empty. Not a single tomato remained. It felt like someone had stolen not just my tomatoes but also a piece of my soul. Gardening wasn't just a hobby for me. It was therapy, an escape from the chaos of life. And now someone had dared to cross that line. At first, I tried to convince myself it could have been a squirrel or maybe even a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random, it was personal. Someone from the neighborhood had trespassed onto my property and taken what belonged to me. As I stared at the barren stems, anger bubbled inside me. Who would do such a thing? And more importantly, why? Then it hit me. Karen. Of course, it had to be Karen. Karen wasn't just the president of our homeowners association, HOA. She was its tyrant, known throughout the neighborhood for her meticulous inspections, passive-aggressive emails, and relentless enforcement of rules no one else seemed to care about. Karen had always made it clear she disapproved of my casual approach to gardening. She once suggested I use more symmetrical tomato cages during one of her so-called routine inspections. Yeah, because nothing says harmony like rigid conformity. But this time, it wasn't just criticism. Someone had physically taken my tomatoes, and if my gut feeling was right, Karen was behind it. Determination burned within me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. No, I decided it was time to fight back. Not with words, but with something far more satisfying. Something spicy. Very, very spicy. Little did Karen know, she had unknowingly planted the seeds of her own downfall. Because while she thought she was controlling the neighborhood, I was about to turn the tables on her. And it all began with a simple idea. What if I gave Karen exactly what she deserved? A taste of her own medicine. It all started with the morning I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, only to find an empty spot where my prized tomatoes had sat just yesterday. I stood frozen, staring dramatically at the gaping space like a father mourning the disappearance of his favorite child. You might think that's an overreaction, but these weren't just tomatoes. They were my pride and joy, and frankly, my only escape from the daily grind. Plus, gardening was cheaper than therapy. As I stood there confessing my loss, I glanced suspiciously around the neighborhood. Peaceful suburbs, manicured lawns, and smiling neighbors suddenly felt sinister. Someone had dared trespass onto my property and snatched away my perfect sun-ripened tomatoes. And I was going to find out who. At first, I tried to convince myself it could have been a squirrel or maybe even a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random, it was personal. The image of a raccoon enjoying an extravagant tomato feast at my expense was somehow comforting compared to the alternative. Someone from the neighborhood was sabotaging my beloved garden. Pushing away paranoia, I walked into the house determined not to overthink things. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, it happened again. Except this time, the thief didn't even have the decency to leave behind evidence. They'd snatched my tomatoes clean, leaving only sad leafy remnants of their former glory. My frustration began boiling over. Determined not to surrender to tomato terrorists, I decided it was time to investigate properly. Armed with my phone camera and a newly purchased wireless security camera system, I began my career as a part-time gardener and full-time detective. My prime suspect quickly became Karen. Yes, that Karen, the infamous president of our homeowners association, HOA. Known throughout the neighborhood for her meticulous lawn inspections, passive-aggressive emails, and dedication to enforcing rules nobody else seemed to know existed, Karen had always seemed overly interested in my garden, especially my tomatoes. On several occasions, she'd openly critiqued them during her routine inspections, once going so far as suggesting I use more symmetrical tomato cages to maintain community standards. I knew she disliked my casual approach to gardening, and frankly, I took pleasure in annoying her by deliberately ignoring her overly detailed gardening tips. I decided I'd start by casually observing her, looking for clues. I didn't need to wait long for suspicious activity. Later that same evening, while watering my plants and feigning complete innocence, I noticed Karen walking her miniature poodle, Princess, past my property. Her eyes narrowed at my tomatoes, or rather, at the sad stubs that had once held juicy fruits. When she saw me watching, she flashed an overly bright smile, raised her hand dramatically in greeting, and remarked, "Oh, what a shame about your tomatoes. Guess gardening isn't for everyone." Her voice carried just enough condescension to raise my suspicions further. I smiled politely and mumbled something about pesky raccoons, though in my heart, I suspected a more malicious animal at play, one wearing pastel cardigans and sensible shoes. After Karen had passed, I swiftly set up my surveillance camera discreetly among the leaves, feeling like a spy conducting a daring undercover operation. I carefully concealed the camera, adjusted the angle, and checked my phone. Perfect. If Karen or whoever was sabotaging my garden returned, I'd capture undeniable evidence. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, anxiously checking the footage from the previous night. Initially, nothing seemed unusual. Birds chirped innocently in the background. A gentle breeze rustled leaves. Then suddenly, there she was, Karen, wearing what could only be described as her stealth mode gardening gloves, a comically oversized straw hat, and pink Crocs. Karen casually approached my plants as if strolling through a grocery aisle. My jaw literally dropped as I watched her reach out, pick a perfectly ripe tomato, and tuck it confidently into a small bag at her side, glancing nervously around as if stealing a tomato was an international crime worthy of the FBI's most wanted list. I sat stunned, emotions swirling between rage, disbelief, and uncontrollable laughter. It felt utterly ridiculous yet painfully personal. Karen, my HOA nemesis, wasn't just criticizing my gardening skills. She was literally robbing me of the fruits of my labor. The nerve, the absurdity, the sheer audacity. Part of me wondered if she planned a neighborhood potluck using stolen produce, perhaps served with a generous helping of hypocrisy. But after my initial amusement faded, determination quickly filled its place. This wasn't just petty theft, it was personal. Karen had crossed the line, and it was time for payback. But not ordinary payback. No, my revenge had to be as memorable as it was satisfying. That's when inspiration struck like lightning. Scrolling through my phone, I landed on a video titled Carolina Reaper Challenge. A grin slowly spread across my face as I watched the video, seeing grown adults cry hysterically, faces red and sweating uncontrollably from the heat. Yes, this was perfect. I would secretly plant Carolina Reapers, the hottest peppers on earth, disguised cleverly among my tomatoes. Karen's next theft would be her last, at least her last comfortable one. My frustration morphed into excitement as I imagined her confidently biting into a pepper expecting juicy sweetness, but instead unleashing fiery chaos. Oh, how poetic justice could be. Before long, I found myself enthusiastically shopping at the local gardening store, idly explaining to a bemused cashier that yes, I was indeed voluntarily planting the world's hottest peppers next to my tomatoes. The cashier's raised eyebrows spoke volumes, but I didn't care. Soon I'd have the perfect bait. Within hours, I was carefully planting Carolina Reaper seedlings amongst my tomatoes, silently apologizing to the unsuspecting peppers for their dangerous mission ahead. As the days passed, I carefully nurtured my secret weapon, the Carolina Reapers, with a mixture of pride, excitement, and mild guilt. Watching them grow was oddly therapeutic, knowing their true purpose was revenge. My tomatoes had been harmless and peaceful, innocent victims of Karen's petty thefts. But these peppers? They were tiny devils growing brighter and angrier with each passing day. Even watering them felt dangerous. Every droplet seemed to sizzle as it hit the soil, like tiny warnings of the fiery pain awaiting whoever disturbed them. Of course, revenge gardening was no easy task. It wasn't long before the neighbors noticed my renewed dedication to my backyard hobby. Curiosity peaked when my previously casual gardening suddenly turned into an intense daily ritual. My neighbor Jerry noticed my unusual enthusiasm one afternoon and cheerfully commented, "Wow, really getting serious with those now, aren't you? Going for Neighborhood Gardener of the Year." I laughed nervously, feeling as guilty as if I'd been caught plotting a bank heist. Jerry didn't need to know about my pepper sabotage, but his good-natured teasing left me momentarily paranoid, wondering who else had noticed my sudden change. Then came the truly unexpected complication. Karen herself decided to pay another visit, happening just as I finished covering up the peppers with care, placing leaves to mask them naturally with the tomatoes. Barely had I admired my camouflage work when Karen's voice cut sharply through the quiet afternoon air. "Interesting choice of fertilizer," she announced, peering skeptically over the fence with her eyes narrowed suspiciously. It all began when I noticed the glaring absence of my prized tomatoes one quiet morning. My heart sank as I stared at the barren stems, imagining the thief who dared to cross that line. Gardening wasn't just a hobby for me. It was therapy, an escape from the chaos of life. And now, someone had taken what belonged to me. At first, I tried convincing myself it could have been a squirrel or maybe even a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random, it was personal. The image of a raccoon enjoying an extravagant tomato feast at my expense was somehow comforting compared to the alternative. Someone from the neighborhood was sabotaging my beloved garden. Pushing away paranoia, I walked into the house determined not to overthink things. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, it happened again. Except this time, the thief didn't even have the decency to leave behind evidence. They'd snatched my tomatoes clean, leaving only sad leafy remnants of their former glory. My frustration began boiling over. Determined not to surrender to these tomato terrorists, I decided it was time to investigate properly. Armed with my phone camera and a newly purchased wireless security camera system, I began my career as a part-time gardener and full-time detective. My prime suspect quickly became Karen, the infamous president of our homeowners association, HOA. Known throughout the neighborhood for her meticulous inspections, passive-aggressive emails, and relentless enforcement of rules no one else seemed to care about, Karen had always made it clear she disapproved of my casual approach to gardening. She once suggested I use more symmetrical tomato cages during one of her so-called routine inspections. Yeah, because nothing says harmony like rigid conformity. But this time, it wasn't just criticism. Someone had physically taken my tomatoes, and if my gut feeling was right, Karen was behind it. Determination burned within me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. No, I decided it was time to fight back. Not with words, but with something far more satisfying. Something spicy. Very, very spicy. Little did Karen know, she had unknowingly planted the seeds of her own downfall. Because while she thought she was controlling the neighborhood, I was about to turn the tables on her. And it all began with a simple idea. What if I gave Karen exactly what she deserved? A taste of her own medicine. The next step was setting up surveillance. I carefully concealed a camera among the leaves, adjusting the angle to capture every move. Perfect. If Karen or whoever was sabotaging my garden returned, I'd catch undeniable evidence. The following morning, I woke before sunrise, anxiously checking the footage. First, nothing seemed unusual. Birds chirped innocently in the background. A gentle breeze rustled leaves. Then suddenly, there she was, Karen, wearing what could only be described as her stealth mode gardening gloves, a comically oversized straw hat, and pink Crocs. I sat stunned, emotions swirling between rage, disbelief, and uncontrollable laughter. It felt utterly ridiculous yet painfully personal. Karen, my HOA nemesis, wasn't just criticizing my gardening skills. She was literally stealing the fruits of my labor. The nerve, the absurdity, the sheer audacity. Part of me wondered if she planned a neighborhood potluck using stolen produce, perhaps served with a generous helping of hypocrisy. But after my initial amusement faded, determination quickly filled its place. This wasn't just petty theft, it was personal. Karen had crossed the line, and it was time for payback. But not ordinary payback. No, my revenge had to be as memorable as it was satisfying. That's when inspiration struck like lightning. Scrolling through my phone, I landed on a video titled Carolina Reaper Challenge. A grin slowly spread across my face as I watched grown adults cry hysterically, faces red and sweating uncontrollably from the heat. Yes, this was perfect. I would secretly plant Carolina Reapers, the hottest peppers on earth, disguised cleverly among my tomatoes. Karen's next theft would be her last, at least her last comfortable one. Before long, I found myself enthusiastically shopping at the local gardening store, idly explaining to a bemused cashier that yes, I was indeed voluntarily planting the world's hottest peppers next to my tomatoes. The cashier's raised eyebrows spoke volumes, but I didn't care. Soon I'd have the perfect bait. Within hours, I was carefully planting Carolina Reaper seedlings amongst my tomatoes, silently apologizing to the unsuspecting peppers for their dangerous mission ahead. As the days passed, I carefully nurtured my secret weapon, the Carolina Reapers, with a mixture of pride, excitement, and mild guilt. Watching them grow was oddly therapeutic, knowing their true purpose was revenge. My tomatoes had been harmless and peaceful, innocent victims of Karen's petty thefts. But these peppers? They were tiny devils growing brighter and angrier with each passing day. Even watering them felt dangerous. Every droplet seemed to sizzle as it hit the soil, like tiny warnings of the fiery pain awaiting whoever disturbed them. Of course, revenge gardening was no easy task. It wasn't long before the neighbors noticed my renewed dedication to my backyard hobby. Curiosity piqued when my previously casual gardening suddenly turned into an intense daily ritual. My neighbor Jerry noticed my unusual enthusiasm one afternoon and cheerfully commented, "Wow, really getting serious with those now, aren't you? Going for Neighborhood Gardener of the Year." I laughed nervously, feeling as guilty as if I'd been caught plotting a bank heist. Jerry didn't need to know about my pepper sabotage, but his good-natured teasing left me momentarily paranoid, wondering who else had noticed my sudden change. Then came the truly unexpected complication. Karen herself decided to pay another visit, happening just as I finished covering up the peppers with care, placing leaves to mask them naturally with the tomatoes. Barely had I admired my camouflage work when Karen's voice cut sharply through the quiet afternoon air. "Interesting choice of fertilizer," she announced, peering skeptically over the fence with her eyes narrowed suspiciously. My heart raced as I turned around slowly, forcing a smile onto my face. "Just experimenting a bit," I responded casually, hoping my voice didn't betray the frantic thoughts racing through my mind. Karen took a dramatic step closer, clearly determined to deliver another of her infamous unsolicited gardening lectures. "Well, just remember," she said, holding her finger up dramatically. "Community guidelines clearly state that old plants must be aesthetically pleasing and non-hazardous." She paused theatrically, letting the words hang heavily between us. "Wouldn't want to accidentally poison anyone now, would we?" she added, arching an eyebrow knowingly. I laughed nervously again, the sound coming out far more suspicious than intended. "Of course not, Karen," I reassured, silently praying she'd leave before noticing my shaky hands and guilty expression. After a tense moment, she finally retreated, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lavender perfume and passive aggression. After Karen's nerve-wracking visit, I decided it was time to accelerate my plans. I obsessively monitored my pepper's growth over the following days, practically counting every new leaf and pepper pod. When the reapers finally ripened, vibrant red and bursting with deadly heat, my excitement hit fever pitch. Carefully, I moved the hottest peppers into prime positions near the tomatoes, strategically placing them so their fiery beauty would prove irresistible bait. The stage was finally set, but catching Karen required more than pepper plants alone. My security camera, now upgraded with motion-activated alerts sent directly to my phone, became my constant companion. Each night felt like a stakeout, my nerves fraying as I monitored live footage from the comfort of my living room. Every rustle of leaves or flicker of movement made my heart race. But night after night passed without action. Impatient and frustrated, I began questioning whether Karen had discovered my plot or had simply lost interest. Then one evening, just as exhaustion threatened to claim victory, my phone buzzed aggressively with an alert. I nearly spilled my coffee in shock, grabbing the device with sweaty palms and opening the camera app with breathless anticipation. The blurry black and white footage revealed a shadowy figure slipping quietly through my garden gate. Adrenaline surged through me. Finally, this was it, The night was quiet, too quiet. My heart raced as I sat in front of my phone, eyes glued to the live feed from the security camera. The garden outside looked peaceful under the moonlight, but I knew better. Somewhere out there, Karen, or maybe someone else, was plotting their next move. 2 days had passed since the teenager's accidental encounter with the Carolina Reapers, and while it wasn't Karen who fell victim this time, the thrill of revenge still lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake off the feeling that Karen was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. She hadn't shown up at my property since then, but her absence felt more threatening than her presence ever did. Every rustle of leaves or flicker of movement on the screen made me jump, my nerves frayed like old wires. Doubts began creeping in. Had she discovered my plot? Was she deliberately avoiding the trap I'd set so carefully? Then came an unexpected twist. Late one evening, as I reviewed the footage from the previous night, I noticed something strange. A shadowy figure slipped quietly through my garden gate. Not Karen's unmistakable silhouette, but a smaller, younger shape. It took me a moment to realize who it was. A teenager from down the street, someone I barely knew. They grabbed a tomato and bit into it casually, only to recoil dramatically, dropping it and frantically fanning their mouth in pain. Watching them dash toward the garden hose, desperate to soothe the fire scorching their tongue, part of me felt guilty. But another part, a bigger part, felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't Karen, no, but it proved one thing. My tomatoes were becoming the neighborhood's hottest underground attraction. Literally. Clearly, I needed to rethink my strategy before my garden turned into the local snack bar. Revenge wasn't going according to plan, but it was certainly getting interesting. But just when I thought things couldn't get stranger, Karen confronted me again. This time, armed with complaints straight from the HOA handbook, she accused me of overcrowding plants and causing visual disorder. Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as though she were personally offended by my garden layout. "You've turned your garden into chaos," she declared, her voice dripping with exaggerated horror. Her theatrics were hard to take seriously, but they sparked an idea. If Karen couldn't resist criticizing every little detail, maybe she wouldn't be able to resist fixing what she saw as unruly either. Maybe all I needed to do was leave things slightly messy, just enough to bait her into acting herself. Without realizing it, Karen had shown me her weakness, her uncontrollable desire to control everything. That evening, I rearranged the peppers openly, deliberately creating a chaotic yet beautifully tempting display. Each pepper practically glowed, its fiery promise hidden in plain sight. As I finished setting my new trap, I whispered confidently into the evening breeze, "Go ahead, Karen. Come and get them." Little did I know how spectacularly my small act of defiance would unravel. The next day arrived with a level of excitement and tension that made my morning coffee taste more like adrenaline. The sun had barely risen when I stepped outside, the air still cool, the garden glistening softly under a layer of dew. My Carolina Reapers glowed fiercely, tiny crimson warnings hiding innocently among the tomato plants. Each pepper was plump, vividly ripe, and deceptively beautiful, like brightly colored grenades waiting patiently to detonate. My heart raced at the thought of Karen's impending spicy encounter. Who knew suburban gardening could turn into an undercover revenge thriller? Carefully inspecting each pepper, I imagined Karen's reaction when her next theft turned into a fiery disaster. Would she scream, run down the street hysterically, or maybe even call an emergency HOA meeting? Each scenario felt both hilarious and satisfyingly justified. But beneath my bravado, a slight pang of guilt crept in. Was I taking things too far? Quickly dismissing the thought, I reminded myself why I was doing this. After all, it was Karen who had repeatedly stolen from me. This was poetic justice, spicy poetic justice, really. With the stage set, I retreated indoors and began my vigil, eyes glued to my phone screen. Hours passed without incident, leaving me restless and slightly frustrated. Doubts crept in again. Had Karen somehow sensed my scheme? Was she deliberately avoiding the trap I'd set so carefully? Just as my impatience peaked, I saw her unmistakable silhouette emerge through the garden gate. My heart rate soared as I watched her every move. Karen moved with exaggerated caution, looking around nervously, glancing toward my house repeatedly. She was hilariously dressed like a cartoon burglar, complete with oversized sunglasses and gloves pulled dramatically over her elbows. She crept toward my tomato plants with absurd stealth, as if fearing someone would leap from the bushes and shout, "Gotcha!" Yet here I was, safely hidden behind my curtains, phone in hand, capturing every amusingly incriminating moment. She reached confidently into the foliage, selecting a particularly vibrant pepper, mistaking it entirely for a juicy tomato. In the dim twilight, my breath caught as she lifted it slowly, examining it briefly before casually biting directly into the pepper. The reaction was instantaneous and spectacularly theatrical. Her eyes widened dramatically as she froze mid-bite, her mouth slowly opening in shock. I leaned closer to the screen, completely mesmerized as Karen's confident demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed panic. What followed was absolute chaos. Karen let out a shriek loud enough to wake half the neighborhood, frantically fanning her mouth with exaggerated desperation. She stumbled blindly, clawing at the garden hose, managing only to spray water wildly into her own face and eyes. Her screams intensified, blending hilariously with the frantic sounds of water spraying everywhere. In a moment of pure comedic justice, her oversized gardening gloves fell into the muddy flower bed as she flailed dramatically, losing all composure. Unable to hold back, I burst into laughter behind my window, feeling a mixture of sympathy and triumphant satisfaction. This was far better and far more hilarious than I ever imagined. The morning after Karen's fiery encounter, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and laughter. By sunrise, the story of her dramatic pepper-induced meltdown had spread like wildfire through the community. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances over coffee mugs and watering cans, their conversations filled with amusement and disbelief. Even those who had previously supported Karen's strict HOA policies were finding it hard not to laugh at the image of her running blindly through sprinklers, screaming dramatically about poisoned tomatoes. But beneath the surface-level humor, tensions simmered. The once friendly neighborhood felt oddly polarized. On one side were neighbors who'd secretly resented Karen's authoritarian rule, now offering covert thumbs-up or approving nods whenever they saw me. They viewed my prank as a justified act of rebellion against her oppressive reign. On the other side stood her loyalists, those upset at what they saw as an unjustified attack on their beloved HOA leader. Jerry, usually neutral, stopped me on the sidewalk looking amused yet concerned. "You know she's not going to let this go easily, right?" he whispered conspiratorially. I sighed deeply, already aware that Karen's revenge was imminent and likely severe. Sure enough, less than 24 hours after the incident, an official HOA letter landed ominously on my doorstep. I stared at the thick envelope like it was an unexploded bomb, hesitating before finally opening it. The language inside was aggressively formal, full of ominous legal jargon accusing me of deliberately cultivating hazardous plants and violating community safety guidelines. The letter demanded my immediate appearance at an HOA hearing scheduled just 2 days away, ominously titled Review of Garden Safety and Neighborhood Standards. Feeling both irritated and slightly nervous, I recognized Karen's revenge strategy, weaponizing HOA regulations instead of backing down after her embarrassing pepper and juice meltdown. Determined to fight back, I prepared carefully for the hearing, meticulously gathering evidence. Armed with video footage clearly showing Karen stealing my tomatoes plus footage of her hilariously unfortunate pepper incident, I felt confident I could expose her hypocrisy. I rehearsed my arguments repeatedly, confident that justice would surely prevail because facts were on my side. Weren't they? When the evening of the hearing arrived, I walked into the community center brimming with cautious optimism. Immediately, though, I sensed tension thicker than stale cafeteria coffee. Karen sat at a long table wearing oversized dark sunglasses indoors, clearly still suffering from her pepper ordeal but dramatically exaggerating her victimhood. Flanked by loyal HOA board members, she watched my every move radiating smug confidence, despite her obvious discomfort. The meeting began promptly, and Karen launched immediately into an emotional, dramatic testimony filled with exaggerated accusations. Her voice trembled theatrically as she described the peppers as dangerous weapons disguised as innocent tomatoes, dramatically claiming she'd suffered emotional trauma, physical injury, and permanent distrust of all gardening activities. She paused repeatedly for dramatic effect, dabbing at imaginary tears with tissues, ensuring everyone present fully appreciated her suffering. I suppressed the urge to roll my eyes, instead calmly awaiting my turn to speak. When finally invited to respond, I stood and confidently presented my case, explaining my innocent tomato-growing hobby that had been repeatedly sabotaged by Karen's petty thefts. I carefully described the escalation, even showing the camera footage as undeniable proof of Karen's repeated criminal activities. As the footage played, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some neighbors gasped dramatically, while others stifled laughter at Karen's visibly uncomfortable reaction to watching her own spicy downfall replayed on a big screen. Just as I expected, victory seemed within reach. However, Karen wasn't done yet. With a flourish worthy of a daytime soap opera, she pulled from her oversized purse another envelope, triumphantly declaring she had official testimony from a horticultural expert claiming that my peppers were not only hazardous, but potentially illegal under local agricultural regulations. Gasps echoed through the room as she dramatically waved the envelope, demanding immediate disciplinary action against me. Her supporters applauded enthusiastically, clearly believing victory was finally within Karen's grasp. My heart sank, panic rising rapidly. This was unexpected and serious, potentially transforming my simple act of revenge into genuine legal trouble. How had Karen escalated something so trivial into a legitimate threat against me? Frustrated and bewildered, I struggled to respond, stumbling briefly under the weight of her accusations. Then, just when things seemed darkest, a surprising ally emerged. Margaret, the normally mild-mannered HOA secretary who rarely spoke during meetings, abruptly stood, capturing everyone's attention. Calmly and confidently, Margaret confessed she'd personally witnessed Karen repeatedly trespassing into my garden and removing tomatoes weeks earlier. Karen turned ghostly pale as Margaret detailed each incident with stunning clarity, her quiet voice lending undeniable credibility. Margaret's unexpected intervention dramatically shifted the room's mood. Many neighbors, previously silent, began openly questioning Karen's integrity, murmuring disbelief at her blatant dishonesty. Caught completely off guard, Karen frantically attempted damage control, denying Margaret's claims and desperately accusing her of collusion and betrayal. Margaret simply shook her head sadly, quietly stating, "Karen, everyone deserves tomatoes in peace." Her words echoed through the now silent room, prompting scattered laughter and nodding agreement. Suddenly exposed and humiliated, Karen stumbled emotionally through her closing statement, attempting to maintain dignity despite clear defeat. The board, clearly shaken by the unexpected turn of events, announced they'd review all evidence privately before rendering their final decision. The meeting ended in intense uncertainty, neighbors filing out in hushed groups, whispering speculation about the outcome and implications for Karen's future. Returning home that night, I felt strangely unsatisfied despite the apparent victory. Karen's manipulations had severely damaged neighborhood trust, creating deep divisions and tensions unlikely to fade quickly. The next morning, I woke up to find a fresh HOA violation notice taped aggressively to my front door. This one accused me of operating an unapproved agricultural enterprise within a residential zone. I let out a short, humorless laugh as I crumpled the paper in my hands. Karen was getting desperate. She had clearly run out of legitimate complaints and was now just making things up as she went. But she had no idea that today, I was bringing something much bigger to the table. As I walked toward the community center for the meeting, I noticed that nearly the entire neighborhood was headed in the same direction. The last meeting had been tense, but this one felt different. People weren't just here out of curiosity. They were here to take sides. Some murmured in hushed voices about Karen's latest antics, while others whispered excitedly about my hybrid peppers, which had somehow become the stuff of neighborhood legend. Even those who had remained neutral up until now seemed to realize that tonight's meeting would be decisive. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Karen sat at the front of the room, her sunglasses perched dramatically on her nose, as if she were still recovering from the trauma of her last pepper incident. She wore her usual pastel cardigan, but her body language betrayed her unease. Despite her attempts to maintain an air of authority, she knew she had lost control of the neighborhood, and for someone like Karen, that was worse than any pepper-induced suffering. The meeting started with the usual formalities. HOA board members droning on about finances and community updates, but everyone knew why they were really there. Finally, Karen cleared her throat and launched into her latest complaint. Her voice dripped with forced concern. "It has come to my attention," she began, "that certain individuals in our community have been engaging in hazardous gardening practices, endangering not only themselves but also their neighbors. I believe it is our duty as responsible homeowners to ensure that our community remains safe and free from such reckless behavior." The room erupted in murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable. Karen turned toward me with an exaggerated sigh, as if addressing a particularly unruly child. "Mr. Thompson," she continued, using my full last name like a disappointed teacher, "your insistence on growing excessively spicy, potentially harmful crops poses a serious risk. Just last week, an unsuspecting teenager was poisoned by your produce." I nearly laughed. The teenager she was referring to had stolen from my garden and learned a hard lesson in not taking things that didn't belong to him. The fact that Karen was trying to spin that into a crime on my part was both ridiculous and predictable. But I didn't need to defend myself. I had something much better planned. I stood up slowly, letting the tension build. "Karen," I said calmly, "if you're so concerned about my gardening, then perhaps you'd like to participate in a little demonstration." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small plate, revealing several of my new hybrid peppers sliced into bite-sized pieces. The room collectively inhaled, recognizing the fiery little devils for what they were. Even those who had never seen them before could sense that whatever was on that plate was no ordinary snack. Karen's expression flickered between suspicion and bravado. "And what exactly is this supposed to prove?" she demanded, her voice slightly higher than before. I smiled. "Well, since you've taken such an interest in my garden, I figured you should at least know what you're talking about. These are the peppers you're so concerned about. And if you truly believe they're a danger, then surely you wouldn't object to testing one yourself." The room was completely silent. Every eye was locked onto Karen. She hesitated, clearly caught between two equally terrible options. If she refused, she would look weak. If she accepted, she was walking directly into my trap. For a moment it seemed like she might back down. But Karen had spent years crafting an image of authority, and she wasn't about to let me destroy it in front of the entire neighborhood. With a tight-lipped smile, she reached forward, plucked a single slice from the plate, and popped it into her mouth. The result was instantaneous. Her face turned a shade of red so vivid it almost matched the peppers themselves. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered horror as the heat slammed into her taste buds with the force of a freight train. She let out a strangled gasp, gripping the table for support. Beads of sweat formed instantly on her forehead, her carefully applied makeup beginning to melt under the intensity of the spice. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out, just a choked wheezing sound as she fought against the fire consuming her from the inside out. She reached blindly for her water bottle, fumbling with the cap, but it was too late. The heat had taken full control. Jerry leaned over and whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Guess those aren't HO approved, huh?" The room, once tense, now erupted into uncontrollable laughter. People clapped, cheered, some even wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the once mighty Karen reduced to a sputtering, helpless mess. Her pride now fully incinerated along with her taste buds. She staggered to her feet and bolted from the room, leaving behind only her chair and what little remained of her dignity. The laughter didn't stop for several minutes. Neighbors high-fived and shook their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. As the meeting wrapped up, the HOA board quietly rescinded all of Karen's recent complaints against me, citing a lack of legitimate evidence. Margaret, ever the quiet observer, simply winked in my direction as she collected her papers. It was over. The war had been won, not with legal arguments or paperwork, but with the power of a single pepper. The morning after Karen's dramatic meltdown at the HOA meeting, I woke up to find a new kind of energy buzzing through the neighborhood. It was as if the air itself had shifted, carrying with it whispers of rebellion and quiet triumph. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen's rules now walked taller, their heads held high. Even those who hadn't directly participated in the showdown seemed emboldened by the idea that someone, me, had stood up to her tyranny. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no, she never was. By mid-morning, another violation notice appeared on my door, this one accusing me of disrupting community harmony through public displays of aggression. The irony made me chuckle darkly. After all, whose actions truly disrupted harmony? Hers or mine? Still, I couldn't deny that Karen had skillfully adapted her strategy. If direct confrontation didn't work, she'd resort to bureaucratic warfare, drowning me in paperwork until I gave up. I decided it was time for a counterattack, not just against Karen but for the entire neighborhood. My hybrid peppers, carefully cultivated in Jerry's secret greenhouse, were ready. These weren't ordinary Carolina Reapers anymore. They were something far more potent, a cross between a ghost pepper and a Reaper, designed to be so hot that even mentioning them sent shivers down anyone's spine. They were perfect weapons, but how could I use them effectively without escalating things further? That evening, I called an impromptu gathering at Jerry's backyard under the guise of a casual barbecue. Word spread quickly, and soon half the neighborhood showed up, eager to hear what I had planned next. As we sat around makeshift picnic tables laden with snacks, none of which included spicy peppers, much to everyone's relief, I explained my idea. What if, I began, we turn this whole situation into something bigger than just revenge? What if we take back control, not just over our gardens but over our lives? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances, some skeptical, others hopeful. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Peterson, leaned forward. You mean, fight back? Not fight back, I clarified. We're not here to bully Karen like she's bullied us. We're here to prove that her rules don't define us. And if she wants to play dirty, then let's show her there are better ways to win. Jerry grinned mischievously, holding up a small jar filled with ground-up hybrid pepper flakes. Behold, he announced dramatically, the ultimate weapon against tyranny. Laughter erupted, but there was an edge of seriousness beneath it. This wasn't just about making Karen miserable anymore. It was about reclaiming our freedom. Over the next few days, the neighborhood rallied together. Some volunteered to help distribute flyers explaining the truth behind Karen's complaints, exposing her hypocrisy to anyone who cared to listen. Others offered to document everything, every email, every complaint, every accusation, in case things escalated legally. Margaret, still quietly heroic, coordinated efforts from behind the scenes, ensuring nothing slipped through the cracks. Meanwhile, I prepared for the final act of defiance. Using Jerry's hybrid peppers, I created a series of harmless but highly visible traps designed to expose Karen's true intentions. For example, I strategically placed tiny packets of pepper flakes near common areas where she often inspected properties. Each packet came labeled with a warning, community safety alert, spicy plants ahead. It was subtle enough to avoid legal trouble but bold enough to send a message. When Karen inevitably stumbled upon one of these warnings during her next inspection tour, her reaction was priceless. She hesitated, visibly torn between ignoring the trap and investigating further. Eventually, curiosity won out, leading her straight into another fiery encounter. Her scream echoed across the street, drawing laughter from neighbors watching discreetly from their windows. This time, though, I didn't hide my amusement. Instead, I recorded the moment, capturing every second of Karen's increasingly ridiculous behavior. Within hours, edited clips circulated among the neighborhood, turning each incident into comedic gold. Slowly but surely, Karen's authority crumbled under the weight of ridicule and disbelief. But victory came at a cost. As tensions escalated, divisions within the neighborhood deepened. Those loyal to Karen accused me of crossing lines, claiming my actions amounted to vandalism or worse. Others, however, saw through her manipulations and sided firmly with the growing resistance. Lines were drawn, alliances formed, and the once peaceful suburb transformed into a battleground of competing ideologies. One evening, while tending to my garden, I noticed a group of kids huddled nearby, staring intently at the rows of tomatoes and peppers. At first, I thought they might try stealing again, but instead, they approached cautiously, asking questions about gardening. Their curiosity sparked something unexpected, a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps this feud wasn't just about defeating Karen. Maybe it was also about inspiring change. As I handed each child a seedling to plant in their own yards, I realized that the battle wasn't over. Not really. But neither was it entirely bad. Somewhere along the way, I had ignited a spark, one that would continue burning long after Karen's reign ended. The days that followed Karen's second fiery encounter were filled with a strange mix of triumph and unease. While the neighborhood buzzed with laughter and admiration for my hybrid peppers, an undercurrent of tension lingered in the air. The HOA meeting had been a decisive victory, but I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She would regroup, plot, and strike again. But this time she'd be smarter, more calculated. I decided it was time to prepare for whatever came next. My garden, once a peaceful sanctuary, had become a battleground. Every leaf, every stem now carried a story of defiance against Karen's oppressive rules. But as much as I enjoyed the satisfaction of outsmarting her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. This wasn't just about tomatoes or even peppers anymore. It was about power, control, and the freedom to live without fear of being judged or fined for every little thing. One morning, while tending to my plants, I noticed a small group of neighbors gathered near Jerry's greenhouse. They weren't just chatting, they were planning. Curious, I approached cautiously, only to find them deep in discussion about forming a committee to challenge the HOA's most ridiculous regulations. Margaret, still quiet but determined, stood at the center of the group, offering suggestions with calm authority. It seemed the seeds of rebellion I had unknowingly planted were taking root across the entire neighborhood. Encouraged by their enthusiasm, I shared my latest idea, a community gardening project where everyone could contribute and benefit from shared resources. We'd grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers together, creating a space that celebrated diversity instead of enforcing conformity. To my surprise, the idea was met with overwhelming support. Within days, several families volunteered their backyards as potential sites for communal gardens. Others donated tools, seeds, and supplies. Even Mr. Johnson, who had previously kept to himself, offered up his expansive front lawn as the perfect location for our first large-scale effort. But Karen wasn't idle. As news of our plans spread, so did her complaints. Violation notices rained down on anyone involved in the project. Claims of overcrowded lawns, improper drainage systems, and even unsightly vegetable patches. Her tactics grew increasingly absurd, but they also revealed her desperation. For the first time, I saw cracks in her armor. Some neighbors refused to comply with her demands outright, while others filed formal grievances against her excessive enforcement. Slowly but surely, Karen's grip on the neighborhood began to weaken. Meanwhile, I continued nurturing my hybrid peppers, not just as weapons but as symbols of resistance. Their heat was unmatched, their reputation legendary. People joked about them openly, sharing exaggerated stories of their potency. One day, during a casual chat with Jerry, he suggested turning them into a product, hot sauce labeled Karen's worst nightmare. The idea caught on quickly, and soon we were bottling batches to sell at local farmers markets. Profits went straight into funding the community garden initiative, further fueling the movement. Yet, amidst all the progress, there remained one unresolved issue: Karen herself. Despite her weakened position, she hadn't backed down completely. Instead, she worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering allies among other HOA boards and filing appeals to higher authorities. Her emails became less frequent but far more menacing, each one dripping with threats of legal action. It was clear she wouldn't stop until she reclaimed her dominance, or destroyed me in the process. That evening, as I sat outside reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized something profound. Revenge alone wasn't enough. Sure, catching Karen red-handed and exposing her hypocrisy brought temporary satisfaction. But true change required more. It required unity, patience, and a willingness to fight not just for ourselves but for the collective good of the neighborhood. What started as a personal vendetta had evolved into something greater. A movement rooted in creativity, resilience, and mutual respect. As I gazed at the rows of thriving plants before me, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever Karen threw our way, we'd face it together. And if she chose to escalate further, well, let's just say I had a few more tricks up my sleeve.